Hello and welcome. My name is Bernard Lamberel and I'm the author of The Covenant on the Origin of the Abrahamic Faith by Means of Deification. This is a historical essay in which I argue that Abraham did exist, but made a covenant with a mortal overlord or a Mesopotamian king instead of a god. In this video here, we're going to be looking at the story of Abraham from a secular standpoint. So instead of looking at it as a religious text, we're going to look at it, what if the covenant had been made with a man? And so here we go. Now, the idea is to look at the patriarchs as historical character. So in the previous video, we were looking at them as a mythical figure, and we argued as to why, logically, they were mythical characters, which is the common scholarly position nowadays. What I'd like to do now is essentially bring you to consider the fact they were historical characters. And I'm going to borrow our man in black, zap your memory, and start all fresh. Yeah. So, what if the text, the story of Abraham, instead of being composed by two separate authors that have combined these texts together, what if we had started with one source? Now, what if in this single source, there were two names? Well, that we know, Yahweh and Elohim. But what if each of these names referred to a separate character? So instead of looking at the same character, what if Elohim and Yahweh were two separate characters in the story? Now, this obviously has some challenges, but let's take a look at this. So, the documentary hypothesis that was initially proposed by Julius Wellhausen, and by the way, I didn't mention that in the previous video, but that theory has really evolved and became a lot more complex and sophisticated than just the idea of Yahweh being one source and Elohim being another source. You got to look into the context and everything. And so there's a fragment hypothesis and all kind of different supplement hypotheses that have derived from that. But fundamentally, the idea remains the same. The Bible has been composed by different elements, and that we don't disagree with. All I'm disagreeing with is that I think in the story of Abraham, and only in that story, we have to look at Yahweh and Elohim as two separate characters. Now, Yahweh is mostly anthropomorphic. So that author in the documentary hypothesis, that author was, I guess, presenting Yahweh, his God Yahweh, more as an anthropomorphic figure. Again, like the Greek gods. And Elohim is mostly immaterial. Now, what if instead of looking at the names, we should look at the nature of these characters? Is the character anthropomorphic or is the character immaterial? And what if we were guiding our analysis based on that? So instead of looking at the two names and say, okay, there was an author who liked to write about Yahweh and another author who liked to write about Elohim, what if we guided our research or our analysis on the fact that there might have been two characters in one story? Forget about the name for now. Just one character was the anthropomorphic character, which would have been our Lord, our physical Mesopotamian king. And there was an immaterial God, just like gods were everywhere in ancient literature. So, for instance, let's look at the text. And let's see if the name Yahweh and Elohim do match all the time their nature. So, for instance, if we posit Yahweh as a Mesopotamian king, then if Yahweh said to him being Abraham, know for certain that for 400 years, blah, 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 then if Yahweh said something, then that's an anthropomorphic figure. He could have been a mortal overlord. Let's take another example. In the same day, Yahweh made a covenant with Abraham. Again, we don't see any problem here. He could have been a mortal overlord. Now, in another text, we read, and Sarai said unto Abraham, behold now, Yahweh hath restrained me from bearing. Now, in this particular case, we see a problem Because if Yahweh was a lord, a Mesopotamian king, how could he have refrained Sarai from being pregnant? Obviously, this is an error. Yahweh, we should read Elohim here, because Elohim, if we think Elohim was a god in the story, like a deity, then it would make sense to pray to a god, or to think that the god might have been angry and prevented Sarah from being pregnant. Another example where we have an issue is, and Elohim said, Sarah thy wife shall bear thee a son indeed, and thou shalt call his name Isaac, and I will establish my covenant with him. So in this case, we have Elohim that talks to Abraham. And again, if we take the premise, or if we adopt the idea that the anthropomorphic character should have been Yahweh and should have been this overlord, this Mesopotamian king, then this is a problem. And he left off talking with him, and Elohim went up from Abraham. Again, if they were talking and the guy leaves, then we should have read Yahweh here and not Elohim. So now there are other instances where Elohim is used properly. So Abraham prayed unto Elohim, and Elohim healed Abimelech. So in this case, actually, this is the only time, the only verse in the entire story of Abraham where Abraham is actually praying, and he happens to be praying to Elohim, which is fine. This is what we would expect, etc. Now, here's a verse that might help us understand the confusion. So that I come again to my father's house in peace, then shall Yahweh be my Elohim. Now here we have an instance where Yahweh, if Yahweh was the overlord king, be my Elohim, become my God. So this might have contributed to the confusion that we're facing today. So these are just a couple of examples. Now, if we look at the actual text of Abraham, so again, Genesis 12 to 25, and we'll do a little bit of statistic here to see what are the probabilities that these names were used randomly, or can we actually see that no, there is a clear indication that Yahweh should have been the anthropomorphic character and Elohim should have been a deity. So there is 135 references to these combined names. So whether Yahweh or Elohim, 135 of them. Now, in terms of specifically how many Yahweh names are used, we find 85 times Yahweh is used, and 50 times Elohim is used. So that means that a majority of time in the story we find the name Yahweh, but still Elohim is used often. Now, if we look at the context, which is the background, so red means anthropomorphic context, green means immaterial context. So we see that Yahweh is an anthropomorphic figure almost all the time, except in a few occasions, while Elohim is much more ambiguous. Actually, a majority of the time, Elohim is found to be anthropomorphic, but still almost all the instances, except 3, where we have an immaterial context, it is Elohim we find. Now, what are the probability of this? So first of all, let's see about the errors and how that might affect the text. In essence, we have 97% of the time where Yahweh is used, he is anthropomorphic. 3% of the time, he is immaterial. So here, clearly, almost 100% of the time, Yahweh is anthropomorphic. Now, Elohim, again, a majority of time, as I mentioned, is anthropomorphic as well, but still almost all times when there is an immaterial, it is Elohim. So this so if we look again in the text, 81% of the instances, it is anthropomorphic. 19% of the time, it is an immaterial figure. Now, if Yahweh is used 63% of the time, and Elohim is used 37% of the time, if we had an even distribution, so if the two names were used interchangeably, it shouldn't matter if they're used anthropomorphic or immaterial. So we should expect the same ratio. So our expectation should be that we have the same ratio of anthropomorphic split between Yahweh and Elohim. So we should have 51% of the anthropomorphic that is Yahweh and 12% that is immaterial, and 30% that is Elohim and 7% that is immaterial. Now, what we find in the text, not what we should expect, what we find, as mentioned earlier, is that 3% is immaterial of Yahweh. So clearly here, the statistics shows us that we're finding Yahweh to be much less immaterial than we would anticipate to find him, and we find Elohim to be much more immaterial than we would expect, because we would expect it to be only 7% if it was a normal distribution, just a standard distribution, and Yahweh 12%. So Yahweh is far less immaterial, and Elohim is far more immaterial than if we just had a random distribution. And so in effect, Yahweh is 6 times less immaterial, and Elohim is 2.4 times more immaterial than what we would expect. So 6 times 2.4 gives us a 93% of chances that these two names represent different characters and are not just one and the same. So we cannot just mix them. So here's a different take on the error distribution, which provides a different visual. So here we can see that Yahweh is an error in only 3 chapters, and that the errors with Elohim are concentrated in mostly in chapters 17, 21, 20, 22, and 25. In every other chapters, 13, 14, 15, 23, and 18, there's just no errors. Every time Yahweh is used, he is used in an anthropomorphic context. Every time Elohim is used in an immaterial context. Now, the secular hypothesis would want us to replace the term Elohim that appears in the text in order to match the nature of that character. And so if we replaced and made all the anthropomorphic characters Yahweh, and if we made all the immaterial characters to be Elohim, then we have a story that becomes all totally different. And the only thing we're changing is the names that are assigned to the different characters. Now, what happens to the story? So, we saw earlier that Genesis 14, which was the story of the Eastern King, didn't fit. Now, if we accept the idea that our Lord here, Lord Yahweh, which makes a covenant to Abraham, if we look at the story tells us that he is destroying the city of Sodom because these people are wicked. The foreign ruler is launching a punitive campaign against the people of Sodom because they revolted and they are sort of wicked as well. And so both of these persona are trying one thing, to subdue Sodom. And as we'll see, if we merge, or if Yahweh is seen, if we understand that the anthropomorphic figure, which we can now call Yahweh, was in league with the Eastern King. So if we posit that, and if we say maybe that whole story is all about Sodom, and it's all about controlling, and maybe these two figures are actually one and the same figure, then what we end up with is a story that is much more consistent. There's a lot of causal effects that trigger and trickle into place. So for instance, if we now have one figure that is this Mesopotamian king that is trying to control the valley of Sidon and all of Canaan, because its importance as a trade corridor between Egypt and Mesopotamia, then now we understand why the fact that these foreign kings launch a punitive campaign, why that affects the fact that the Sodomites, when Lord sends his messengers to see the situation at Sodom, we're finding that the mob is basically angry at these messengers because they represent the authority that has kept them vassal for so many years. And if they want to sodomize these messengers, it's so they can feel the pain of what it is to be submitted for so many years. The same thing, if Abraham negotiates with the Lord to save the people of Sodom, it's because he was blessed by Melchizedek. If Abimelech fears Abraham and the Lord, it's because he saw how the Lord launched this punitive campaign, etc. So the whole story gets a lot tighter, and everything starts making a lot more sense. And the whole reason for making a covenant with Abraham is because Abraham defeated the army of this king, and so the king had only one of two options: either retaliate and do another punitive campaign, but leaving from Mesopotamia with an army to go all the way to Canaan was quite an expedition back then. And so probably the easiest way and the better solution would be to turn Abraham into an ally by making a covenant with him, by offering him and promising him the land of Canaan in exchange for his absolute loyalty. So Abraham would have to respect the laws of this new Lord and apply them locally, and this way the Lord would have someone of trust locally. Now, how does this fit with what we know on the process, and how could this have happened? So first of all, we know that in the Bronze Age and Middle Bronze Age, the cult of the dead was practiced and was common. So if this Lord was such an important figure, and if the descendant of Abraham inherited this land because of this God, we can see why they would have been tempted from nomadic people they were, which were now given a land. They would start to celebrate the memory of this Lord, and eventually the benevolence and the memory and the spirit, and slowly make this persona into their God. And the idea that this was initially a ruler in the story is kind of vacated and goes away. And in fact, Yahweh and Elohim now becomes one and the same. So this is the idea behind how to read the story. Now, what are the textual evidence for a mortal Lord? I mean, what's in the text that can help us further solidify this idea? So not only now what we did is we looked at the big picture of the story, and we can see how that story makes so much more sense when we look at it from the perspective of Yahweh being in league with these four Eastern king and wanting to subdue Sodom. Now, what additional evidence is there in the text that would allow us to understand what happened there? So first of all, let's take a look at the story of Genesis 14 a little bit more. So again, here 12 years they served Kedorlaomer, and in the 13th year they rebelled. And in the 14th year, launched a punitive campaign with some of his ally. So in Genesis 14:20, "And blessed be the Most High God, which had delivered thine enemy into thy hand, and he gave him the tithes of all." Now this is Melchizedek, who is essentially blessing the God for Abraham, because this God delivered the enemy into the hands of Abraham. Now the verse before, "He also blessed him, saying, Blessed be Abraham by God Most High, possessor of the heaven and the earth." So one verse before, the "he" is Melchizedek. Here, he's blessing, he continues. The person doing the action is still Melchizedek. He blesses the God because he delivered the enemy into the hand, and he gives him tithes of all. Why should we think this he is a different persona than Melchizedek? So I think it makes a lot more sense to understand this he as being Melchizedek, giving Abraham retribution for having put his people at risk by chasing and fighting off these foreign kings. Now, remember here that Melchizedek is thanking the God for putting the enemy into the hands of Abraham. Verse later, and Abraham said to the king of Sodom, I have lifted up mine hand unto the Lord, the Most High God, the possessor of heaven and earth. Now, what does this expression mean? It's, people read this and it's kind of weird because we've got now Abraham raising his hand, swearing to God that he's not going to take anything from the king of Sodom. Now, if we look at this sentence, I have lifted up mine hand unto the Lord, the literal interpretation is to swear, and this is indeed what most translation do. A lot of translation will even write, he swore. Yet, there's not a single other example of anyone in the Old Testament raising in his hand to swear. Quite contrary, every instance where raising a hand is used is a military context to strike someone. So again, a verse before, Melchizedek was thanking the high gods for having put in the hand of Abraham his enemies. Right? And so here, what I believe Abraham is telling the king of Sodom is that he's basically raised his army against the Lord. Because that's what he did. In Genesis 14, Abraham goes after this Lord and basically defeats him by night. So he actually raised his hand, his army, against the Lord. And this is indeed what we find in so many other places in the Old Testament where somebody's raising a hand against somebody. And so this would be a confirmation that indeed Abraham raised his army against the Lord, and therefore this Lord is in league with the Far Eastern king. Now there's further evidence and stronger evidence that is interesting. And God said, or the Lord said, Sarah thy wife shall bear thee a son indeed, and thou shalt call his name Isaac, and I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant. So clearly the Lord is not happy with Ishmael being the son of Abraham and the heir to the covenant. Why is that? In the story itself, there's absolutely nothing wrong with Ishmael, except that he was born from an Egyptian maid. Now, by being born from an Egyptian maid, and pretending to become the heir of a covenant that was made with a Mesopotamian king, there's a problem there. In the event of a fight or war between Mesopotamia and Egypt, where would the allegiance of this son go? Towards Egypt or towards Mesopotamia? So that's a problem. And so what's the solution? Solution's coming right next. The Lord asks, where's your wife, Sarah? There, in the tent. And then a few verses later, and the Lord visited Sarah, as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had spoken. Now, if we look at this from a religious perspective, we understand that the Spirit of God is visiting Sarah so that she can become pregnant. And indeed, 9 months later, she gave Abraham a son. But if we look at the story and we say, well, this is actually a Mesopotamian king that is talking to Abraham and that is visiting Sarah in the tent, and that he did for Sarah as he had spoken, I'm sorry, but the guy is basically screwing up Sarah and getting her pregnant. And so the son is fathered by the Lord, not by Abraham. And so what comes next? So next, for Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age, at the set time of which the Lord had spoken to him, and Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him, whom Sarah bore to him, Isaac. So we're not seeing here in the story that Abraham fathered Isaac. We're just being told that he was given a son through Sarah. Now, don't be offended too much about this, because just a few chapters before, it was Sarah who gave her maid to Abraham. And so Abraham screwed the maid in order to have a heir. So it was a common thing to do back then. And here we have the Lord who needed to take things in his hand, so to say, and he wanted to have the best possible heir for this covenant. And this is why Isaac is referred to as the son of the promise, because he's the perfect son. Sarah, being Abraham's half-sister, carries the gene of the family. And so Isaac has blood which is part of the family of Abraham. So Abraham is happy, and he's raising this kid as if it was his. And the Lord couldn't be happier, because now it's his own seed that is going to inherit this whole land. So it's a combination of Abraham and Sarah and this Lord. So obviously this causes a problem with Ishmael. So Abraham talks to his Lord and said, oh, I hope Ishmael is going to live before thee. And obviously because Ishmael was the firstborn. And so the firstborn should normally inherit. And so, so obviously there's a concern there. And indeed that concern is so strong that in Genesis 22:2, then God said, take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah, sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you. We've got a problem here, because if the Lord actually fathered Isaac, do you think it would make sense that he would ask Abraham to sacrifice his own son? That doesn't make sense. So when I first ran into this problem, I thought, okay, well, we've got a serious issue here. It sounds like that whole proposal collapses, and just that idea of a mortal or king making a covenant with Abraham just doesn't make sense. Unless, of course, we can demonstrate that the name Isaac was inserted as an afterthought by priests wanting to clarify the name of the son. So if we look at this sentence, and we look at it from a religious perspective, obviously, it makes sense that Isaac would be the son of the promise. I mean, he's the cherished son. He's the son that makes the whole thing happen. So obviously, he should be the son that is loved and the only son that has any value, per se. But if we look at it from a secular perspective, as I mentioned, it's impossible that the Lord, who basically fathered this son to become his heir, would want to sacrifice him. So that's the problem we have. Now, it's interesting when you look at, in Judaism, it's Isaac that gets sacrificed. In Christianity, it's the same idea. It's Isaac. However, for Muslims, they agree on the same story. All these religions are called Abrahamic religion for a reason. They all believe in Abraham's God. So why would Muslim agree on everything else in the story except that specific and critical thing, which is the name of the son asked to be sacrificed? So if in the story, let's say in the tradition, in the written tradition or even in the oral tradition, the name of the son had been specified. So obviously at some point that would have given us the Torah and the Hebrew Bible, and then same thing would have carried over to New Testament, and so it would make sense to have Isaac. But how could we explain that Ishmael would have been inserted here? So some people will say, well, it's because Muslim claim that they're descendant from Ishmael, so for them the name of the son, is most important son, is Ishmael. Yeah, but if in the story the name Isaac was written down, it'd be a bit weird that they would go as far as changing the name. However, if there was no name in the original story, not the ones we have now, but some original story, then it would make a lot of sense that some priest would clarify by putting the name that's important for the Jews, Isaac. The Christian would have just followed along. But it would have also allowed the Muslim to believe that Ishmael was the better son. And actually, in fact, in the Quran, there's no name, the name of the son is not mentioned. So that gives us a pretty good evidence to suggest that the original material did not have a name in it. And so for the Muslim, it made sense that it was Ishmael. There was no problem assuming it was Ishmael, etc. So, but I think that fundamentally, this idea that we have at this critical junction in the story and in the interpretation of the story, we have two groups that are claiming different names is allowing us to at least consider the idea that perhaps there was no name in the text. And if there was no name in the text, then there's no problem with the secular interpretation we're offering. So let's review again, in the context of history, how this new interpretation fits. So again, if we take the idea that the entire story of Abraham, there's only one anthropomorphic character, and he's a Mesopotamian overlord, and he's in league with these four Eastern kings, then we don't have any more problem with Genesis 14. Quite the contrary. Genesis 14 becomes a key element in the entire story because it set the stage. It explains why a covenant is necessary to maintain law and order in this region, and why Abraham is turning out to be the best possible candidate because he's shown loyalty to the Sodomites by going and defeating the people against a mighty army, and therefore he's a man of value and honor, and it makes sense to make a covenant with this guy. Now, in terms of the context, so we know the Canaanites were celebrating the cult of the ancestor, so there's no problem there. Now, tradition places the story right here. And so if this Lord's memory was elevated to the rank of deity, we find soon after in Shechem, which is a critical town where Abraham inhabited, a temple is being erected to worship Baal Berith. Now, Baal only means Lord. Baal is not a demon. Baal is the name for a lord, just like Adonai, and even wife would call their husband Lord, Baal, and so it's not just it's a generic name that means Lord. And Baal Berith means Lord of Covenant. A Berith is a covenant in Hebrew. And so a temple for Baal Berith is erected in Shechem soon after. Now, this deity is sometimes referred to as Baal Berith and other times as El Berith in the Bible. Some scholars think maybe it could be two deities bearing similar names, Baal Berith, El Berith. But it's clear that if Baal was deified, Baal became El. And therefore Baal Berith and El Berith refer to one and the same Lord, the memory of this Lord that was elevated. So a little bit later, we find that many Baals are celebrated in Canaan. And so it makes total sense then that if the Lord of Abraham is this Baal Berith, that Joshua, when he comes and reassert the covenant with Yahweh, goes back to that temple. And so the temple that used to be the temple of Baal Berith is now the temple of Yahweh, Yahweh Elohim. And so the current understanding from scholars that the story of Abraham could not have possibly originated in the Bronze Age is I wouldn't say refuted, but is definitely seriously challenged, because we can show that this story makes a lot more sense and that it could have evolved this way, and that during the exile and the return of exile, basically Yahweh, the religion of Yahweh become more defined, and monotheism really developed. And in terms of the method of transmission, the idea that a secular covenant, which was a state affair, was written on tablet, whether on clay or on stone tablets, and preserved in a wooden chest and carried around as a deed to the land, makes perfect sense. Now we can see, we can visualize these Israelites, the descendants of Abraham, having on record their deed to the land. They want to be able to show, hey, this is our land, we've got proof here, and this is how this treaty came to be. Because that, if 2,000 years before Christ, we don't have any record of treaties. It starts somewhere around 1600, 1400 before Christ. We have some examples of treaties across nations. So there were no real treaties back then. So what's the best way to record something than to tell the story how it came to be? How did they came to have this land? So obviously now we can see this ark, as I mentioned, just as being this chest, this valuable chest containing valuable documents from a god. Because obviously after so many generations, that memory got lost of a physical lord, and it just became a god that was being celebrated among other gods. So that kind of concludes this this episode or this video on the textual interpretation and the historical interpretation that can be given to the story of Abraham. There's a lot more details, obviously, in the book. This is just a brief summary, so I'll certainly invite you to take a closer look. In the next video, we're going to look at biblical chronologies. So again, we have a problem here where how can Sarah gave birth at 90-year-old? Does that make any sense? Why aren't chronologies aligning with history if this is the case? So this is what we're going to be talking about in the next video, and I'm looking forward to having you back.